Hello and welcome. My name is Cristina Mora, and I'm the co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies and a professor of sociology here at UC Berkeley. It is my pleasure to moderate this event today, the first of IGS's fall 2020 events focusing on the future of democracy. Today, our panel focuses on the future of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program initially implemented under the Obama administration in 2012. Since then, the program has provided work authorization and temporary, although some would say tenuous, relief from deportation proceedings for an estimated 800,000 immigrants who arrived in the US as children. In the fall of 2017, the Trump administration announced that it would begin a phasing out of DACA and would not renew the program, sparking lawsuits from states and advocacy groups across the country. For over 2 years, DACA recipients and their families waited anxiously to learn the fate of the program as the cases made their way through the Supreme Court. On June 18, 2020, the Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration, deciding that the decision to end the program was arbitrary and capricious. Many dreamers and DACA holders were thus able to breathe a collective sigh of relief, but the legal landscape for them remains still very much uncertain. Today, we have 3 stellar academic experts here to help us make sense of what has happened, how we got here, and what lies ahead. Specifically, we have Jennifer Chacon, professor of law at UCLA, Shannon Gleason, Associate Professor of Labor Relations, Law, and History at Cornell University, and Laura Enriquez, Associate Professor of Chicano Latino Studies at the University of California at Irvine. Welcome, everyone. We are honored to have you here with us today. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to announce that this event is being co-sponsored by very many, actually too many to name individually, centers, schools, and research units here at UC Berkeley, including the Othering and Belonging Institute, the Latinx Research Center, and Berkeley Law. Also, just a note to the audience, we're listening and we want to take your questions. So please feel free to post them on the YouTube comments bar, and we'll take as many as we can in our time here together. Okay. To begin, let me start with Professor Chacon. Jennifer, hi Jennifer. Can you give us an overview of the legal landscape now? I mean, how did we get here? And what should we be paying attention to right now with respect to DACA?
Oh, great, thank you. So I will take you back a little bit further than you went and just think about, I'll take us back to 2008, another election campaign cycle with Barack Obama then running for president and promising to enact immigration reform when he came into office. And that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. But what did happen is that Congress continued to do what it had been doing for years prior to that, increasing funding for immigration enforcement. The Department of Homeland Security was working to implement the so-called Secure Communities program nationwide, so fully integrating state and local enforcement into the federal immigration enforcement process. So rather than reform and stability and security for immigrant communities, we actually saw a cresting wave of banishments of immigrants from the interior of the country. And this included the removal of a lot of longtime residents. Those interior removal numbers hit record levels in 2009, and then again in 2010, and then in 2011. So those numbers were going up and up. Thanks to Senate filibuster rules and the composition of Congress, there was no immigration reform on the table. So in response to these enforcement realities and the legislative realities, we saw organizers and activists led by young people staging nationwide bus rides, cross-country walks in Washington, lots of brave actions, pressuring the Obama administration to do something. And that is really what gave rise to DACA. So in 2012, in a really narrow response to these pressures, sort of what the administration felt it could do, then Department of Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano issued the memo announcing Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. And that kicked off in the summer. It was not an executive action. It was a Department of Homeland Security enforcement memo. It announced enforcement priorities and the implementation mechanism for implementing those priorities. The decision not to pursue removal against particular individuals is a power that courts have long understood executive agencies, the Department of Homeland Security here, to have. So while there were a few scattered legal challenges to DACA, those challenges all failed. In 2014, the Republicans were in control of Congress. There was no chance of legislative immigration reform, and the Obama administration decided, let's expand DACA. So they lifted the age cap, lengthened the time of renewals, and also added a new program, Deferred Action for Parents, or DAPA, which would have covered certain parents of US citizens and lawful permanent residents, though quite controversially, not the parents of DACA recipients. At this moment, Texas and a number of other states successfully sued to stop the DACA expansion and the DAPA program from going into effect. A federal district court enjoined those programs, and that injunction was upheld by the Fifth Circuit. It went to the Supreme Court, and after the death of Antonin Scalia, the court split 4-4. Without opinion, affirmed the decision of the Fifth Circuit that kept the DACA expansion and the DAPA program from going into place. But importantly, the DACA program remained in effect, had never been subject to any of these legal challenges. And in fact, the lower court decisions on DAPA took pains to distinguish that program from DACA. Nevertheless, as you said, in 2017, when Donald Trump came into office, his then acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Elaine Dukes, announced in September that the DACA program would be wound down. The sole reason that she gave was that the administration believed the program was illegal. And for this, she relied entirely on a thin legal analysis in a letter by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions. So lawsuits were filed around the country, and DACA recipients were really some of the most important litigants and lawyers in this litigation. So they were telling their stories, they were taking their battle to court to stop this rescission from going into effect. And unlike the 2012 litigation against DACA, the 2017 litigation to protect DACA was very successful. So beginning in early 2018, district courts around the country were enjoining the rescission and keeping the DACA program in place. And those lower court decisions were upheld by reviewing circuit courts. And as you said, in June, we saw the Supreme Court agree that the administration had violated the law in attempting to rescind DACA in the way that it did. The decision was a sort of surprise 5-4, with Chief Justice Roberts joining the 4 more liberal justices and authoring the opinion. For those of us who are concerned about questions of equality, the court's reasoning left a lot to be desired. 8 of the 9 justices, all but Justice Sotomayor, concluded that the plaintiffs had failed to offer sufficient evidence of racial discrimination to proceed with their legal challenges on equal protection grounds. And this, in spite of the explicit anti-Latino and anti-Mexican statements made by Trump and other members of his administration, and the hugely disproportionate negative effect the rescission would have on Mexicans and Central Americans. But the court sort of set that challenge aside, said there was insufficient evidence, and instead found the problem with the rescission was that the administration hadn't followed the procedures required by law under the Administrative Procedures Act. The majority opinion noted, as you said, that the administration's reasons for the rescission, that the program was illegal, had been made in ways that failed to consider the administration's recognized legal authority to use its discretion in the enforcement of immigration laws. And the opinion also noted, importantly, that the administration failed to weigh the interests of the many people, not just DACA recipients, but also their employers and their communities, who relied on the continuation of this program. And so this failure to properly weigh the reliance interest was also problematic under the Administrative Procedures Act. It seems pretty clear what should have happened next. So the rescission has been declared unlawful, and we should have returned to the status quo ante in place the day before the rescission in September of 2017. US Citizenship and Immigration Services should have gone back to processing not only renewals, but also new applications under the same terms that existed prior to Duke's announcement. After all, since there had been no proper consideration of any changes to DACA and the region's decision made clear that such considerations were necessary, it seemed like we had to go back to where we were. What happened instead was pretty chilling. Both Chad Wolf, the illegally acting head of the Department of Homeland Security, and Ken Cuccinelli, the illegally acting head of US Citizenship and Immigration Services, neither of whom have Senate confirmation, and both of whom are in their positions in violation of the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, both issued statements questioning the legality of the Supreme Court's decision. Wolf said that the ruling, quote, usurps the clear authority of the executive branch, end quote, which is troubling, given that the court's interpretation of the Administrative Procedures Act is binding and tells us what the authority of the executive branch is in this regard. And Cuccinelli went even further. He called the decision, quote, an affront to the rule of law, end quote, ignoring the fact that since Marbury versus Madison, it's been precisely the province of the Supreme Court to declare what the law is in situations such as these. The irony of these two illegally appointed officials questioning the legality of a decision of the Supreme Court is stunning and should give us some pause. And so are the steps that they took next. USCIS announced that they would not be accepting new applicants for DACA. They also announced that the DACA renewal cycle would be shortened from 2 years to 1, keeping DACA recipients in a now almost constant cycle of renewal and uncertainty. There's no justification for these changes, which seems to violate the Supreme Court's holding that changes to the DACA program can only be made after valid procedures of consideration. So unsurprisingly, there's now ongoing litigation challenging these latest maneuvers by DHS, including proposed class litigation to challenge these changes. And what happens in November's election, both presidential and congressional, will be hugely important to the story of what happens next.
Wow, thank you for that comprehensive overview. And so it seems right now then, rather than having sort of settled the matter and settled the legal landscape, there's still even much more uncertainty around everything that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's surprising. We would expect that there would at this point be a pretty clear path forward. The Supreme Court certainly didn't say that the administration couldn't rescind DACA, but they were pretty clear that if the administration wished to rescind DACA, they needed to appropriately weigh the interests at stake, deliberate, take into account the legal authority that they had, and draw proper distinctions between that which they are authorized and not authorized to do. None of that's happened. So instead, we see sort of further action without consideration, which seems to fly in the face of what the Supreme Court told them to do. The Supreme Court didn't make it hard, I think, to rescind DACA, but this administration has failed to sort of meet the bar of what was required.
Wow. I wonder how might this meet? Maybe this is a great question for Professor Gleason. Shannon, how do you think that all of what has gone on might be impacting the immigrant community at large? How is this reverberating across local immigrant community groups and local governments? What's the feel more on the ground here?
Sure. Thanks for having me, everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit in terms of thinking through the shift from our focus on policy enactment to policy implementation. Yeah. And I think there's a lot to be learned if we look beyond the letter of the law. And in the last 8 years that we've had with DACA, what do we know about the impacts, not only of the program, but also in terms of how local governments are moving? For those unacquainted with immigration law, this is typically thought of as being in the federal realm of policymaking, but especially with a program like DACA, we find that it actually has engaged state and local governments and overwhelmingly different civil society actors. And so I want to say a little bit about some of the work that we've done in conjunction with a colleague, Els de Graaf, political scientist at Baruch, looking at the impact of DACA in 3 traditional immigrant serving destinations: the Houston area, the New York City metro region, and the San Francisco Bay Area. And a couple of things that I want to highlight is that the conversations around DACA are absolutely a federal and a national question, but also that individuals are really experiencing the program and both the benefits and the barriers that it presented in very distinct ways. And 2 of the things that we found in talking both with stakeholders as well as individuals who had applied for the DACA program themselves is that DACA really impacted 2 main things. One is the way in which they thought about DACA, which actually at the beginning, Jennifer, maybe you can weigh in on this, was not seen as a risk-free venture. In fact, in the early days, maybe attorneys were very much afraid of the current moment in which we're in, and certainly handing over your information and your family's information came at a cost. And so individuals were really weighing not only the financial costs, but also the benefits that they would get through this program. And 2 of the things that people often talk to us about was obviously the educational benefits that DACA might provide, both in terms of financial aid, decisions they were making about their professional pathways, things as as minuscule as licensing. Could I become a lawyer? Can I go into the medical profession? For example, in the Houston area where there's a huge energy sector, could I get access to what's called a TWIC card that would give me access onto a lot of these oil refinery sites where there's oftentimes much more stable employment. And so DACA became a very practical consideration for folks. The other piece of it, though, had to do with policing and safety and belonging, and how people were seeing themselves as being othered, even in these very traditional immigrant destinations. And one of the things that we found is that even though some of the other things that I just mentioned do vary a lot from state to state, so especially in a place like California, where you have strong state protections for access to financial aid and university campuses, and people were weighing not only the cost, but the risk of DACA against what AB 540 already would provide for them. In a place like Houston and Texas, where even though you had a state DREAM Act in place, some of these other questions about licensing and access to aid really mattered. But the question about policing and safety and belonging was a universal concern, not only across metro regions, but also between central city and suburb, and in some cases outlying rural areas. And so the universal challenge of what to do when one gets stopped, if they have access to some sort of identification that would put them and the family members that they often had with them at risk, is something that we see in the current moment. And so not only is the current moment about DACA and uncertainty around DACA, but it is couched in the broader moment of the uptick, or what many of us would characterize as a continuation of the carceral state and immigration enforcement that is terrorizing immigrant communities. And this was a universal challenge, regardless of whether people were in the central city or in the suburbs. A few other things in terms of the practicalities. DACA, like many other federal immigration policies, was an unfunded program. In other words, this was handed down from the federal government, but nothing came with it in terms of resources to help implement it in local communities. And so this is where we see local governments and civil society and many of the university campuses that we work at really having to step in to fill that void, to provide things like legal services. In many cases, philanthropy and local governments were working hand in hand around how to fund access to DACA. And certainly in the current moment, the continuation of immigration enforcement has also meant whether or not they're providing support for deportation defense. So having DACA does not necessarily keep you from engagement in the immigration enforcement deadline. Certainly the 2-year renewals and now 1-year renewal at every stage that you're engaging DACA means that you're also engaging the immigration enforcement apparatus. And so the way that local governments really played a role was not only with funding, but also providing directives to local law enforcement about how to engage with individuals who might have temporary status or different iterations of an EAD, an employment authorization document, and also training to school officials in the K-12 system, and in the current moment, thinking through public health initiatives. And so if you are a DACA person or someone who was undocumented and eligible for DACA, the current moment really shows us the importance of the local initiatives for access to public health and COVID testing, et cetera. I want to end by kind of thinking through the ways in which I think DACA and the current anxiety around DACA really highlights a number of other issues that this population is contending with. And so it's not simply immigration law per se, right? So it's not simply access to DACA, but the whole other range of what we might think of as poverty law or public interest law. For those of you like Jennifer who are in the legal field, certainly that you know that when an individual who has an immigration concern comes to you, you all of a sudden turn into also a labor and employment lawyer, also a immigration advocate. And so I think that this is an arena where the conversations that we're having today, so certainly think about DACA specifically, but also how it relates to these other public policy, but also legal arenas where we need to be investing and where local governments have really filled a big role, or in some cases not.
Well, thank you. Professor Enriquez, I wonder if you could comment a bit about how this is all reverberating then as well on college campuses. I mean, Shannon just mentioned the educational benefits of DACA, but also the anxiety that the community is sort of feeling more broadly. How is this playing out among, I guess one would argue, more of the advantaged sectors of the community, right? Those in the University of California, for example, or those that have sort of quote unquote made it up the educational tier.
Yeah, definitely. So the UC, if we just focus on the University of California, the UC hosts about 4,000 undocumented students, right? So a small but sizable population. And undocumented students actually make up about 3% of California's college student population. So at the UC, the majority of undocumented students have DACA, but there is a substantial and growing group that have no legal status, right, that don't have DACA because of this rescission saga, right, that's been dragging on, and they weren't able to apply. And these are mostly the incoming students, right, so the students that we're welcoming into our classrooms now largely were not able to apply, right, and still being held off. And students that are first years or second years kind of fall into here, but also third and fourth years who just weren't able to apply for different reasons, or were unable to or unwilling to take those risks, right? So we do have this sizable population that doesn't have DACA. So I want to talk a little bit about, or most of this, about sort of what plays out there between those two groups. But in terms of thinking about the student population, the UC and other educational institutions are really having to think closely, or should be thinking closely, about DACA as they're designing policies and programs, because often the policies and programs are designed to, or designed to help students with DACA, right? Or assume that students are having DACA when they don't necessarily. So part of this puzzle is actually understanding where the gaps are within the undocumented student population. What's different between students that have DACA and those that don't, and how different are they from, you know, our everyday, our other student populations, right? So that's really where my work fits in. So I'm leading a UC-wide initiative, the UC Collaborative to promote immigrant and student equity. And we recently surveyed almost 2,800 UC students with immigrant parents last spring. And that includes a group of undocumented students, US citizens with undocumented parents to look at mixed status families. And then also US citizens with legal immigrant parents, right? So comparing across these three groups to see what are the levels of differences between them, but then also looking within the undocumented student group to see what are the differences between those with DACA and those without. So if we look at undocumented students, and we're sort of starting to preliminary analyze our data, so I have some descriptives that I can share for the first time. Undocumented students have compromised education and well-being outcomes, which is what we know, right? Looking at all the past research, and we can really see that very clearly in this data, right? So about 25% of the undocumented students that we surveyed had a GPA over 3.5, right? Versus 38% of those with legal immigrant parents, right? So this is a substantial gap in their academic performance. They're also overrepresented in the lower GPA groups, right? So under 2.5. 45% expressed anxiety symptoms that would warrant clinical intervention, right? Which is a huge number. And is about 7% higher than their peers with legal immigrant parents. 28% expressed depressive symptoms that would also warrant clinical intervention. That's also significantly higher than their peers with legal immigrant parents. So we know that this is a very vulnerable population, right, that needs support. In general, and I think that's usually where this conversation stops. So what we really wanted to do was disentangle, right, those with DACA and those who have no legal status. So about 70% of our participants had DACA and the other 30% didn't, and had no current legal status, right? So we had a couple folks that had TPS, temporary protected status, or U visas or other kinds of temporary legal statuses. But in terms of analysis, we kind of exclude them because they're a very small group. So surprisingly, there are not always significant differences between students with DACA and those with no legal status. In terms of those mental health, right, the anxiety and depression, there are actually no differences between the groups, which we would expect that there should be or might be, right? Some protection provided by DACA. About a quarter say that their immigration status contributes to them being distracted in class once a week or more. And about a fifth say the same for losing study hours as frequently. So these are really significant potential academic impacts, right? If you're not paying attention in class, if you're not studying enough, or studying as much as you would like, that would affect your GPA, right? Your performance in class. And this really speaks to the limited reach of DACA, right? Or perhaps the unique stressors of the court case, right? Because we were surveying folks late spring as we were leading up to the handing down of the Supreme Court decision, right? So this is when there was constant emails and notifications. It could be this week, it could be next week, it could be, right? And sort of keeping folks on edge, perhaps contributing to that, these outcomes and distractions. So what we do see that DACA does enable significant opportunities that are not afforded to their peers with no legal protections, right? So we see this in career preparation. About half of those with DACA had access to one or more career preparation experiences like internships, compared to only 37% of those with no legal status. And those with DACA were also significantly more likely to feel that they could pursue their desired career regardless of their immigration status. We also see this in resource access. So only 30% of those with DACA reported being denied access to campus resources, which is less than the 38% of those with no legal status. So there is differences there, but I think it's worth noting, right, that those are still pretty high percentages, right, that folks are being denied resources, but those with no legal status are being denied even more. And I think these career preparation and resource access makes sense given the work authorization provided by DACA, right? So that's really what's making a difference here in accessing these opportunities provided on college campuses, because they're able to get the paid internships, right, that are more likely to exist, or to be able to do, or feel comfortable participating in like biometrics or other kinds of things that they would have to participate in to work in certain kinds of settings or to volunteer in certain kinds of settings. And I think this is also a place where campuses are starting to intervene, noting the growing population that doesn't have DACA, right, that has no legal status and no work authorization. And so trying to create inclusive internship programming that would support and engage that student population. And then I think one final interesting point around campus climate was that respondents with DACA were more likely to report hearing faculty and staff express positive feelings about undocumented immigrants, which is interesting given that they're literally occupying the same spaces, right? They're hearing the exact same people talk, but those with DACA are reporting more positive feelings, more positive support. Which makes sense because the conversation really has been about DACA, right? It was the UC fighting for DACA. It was the UC sending out, right? It was administrative messages about we support our students and we're here for you despite DACA and whatever happens. And there's a lot of conversation about DACA, and that leaves out the students, right? The large group of students that don't have that, contributing to sort of very diverging experiences of the campus context. So I think moving forward, it's really important to think about the diversity of experiences around DACA and the ever-shifting policy context, right, as well as the discourse that's accompanying it.
Well, those are fascinating results. Thank you. I just want to remind our audience that we're taking your questions on the YouTube comments bar. We're happy to pose them to our panelists here today. And what you were saying, Laura, it makes me think then about sort of, so you mentioned those sets of students that are now on our campuses that basically just didn't have access, right? The timing was off, and so they're coming in without this. And I wonder, Jennifer, maybe you can speak to historically, what has been those disparities more broadly in access to DACA? We tend to think that automatically if you came in, or that under Obama, if you came to the US as a child, you could automatically get access to this, but looks like there might have been disparities then too. How has access to DACA changed over time?
Well, I think even at its inception, there were disparities. So there was the age cap, which meant that there were people who had struggled and fought for some sort of legal reprieve who were just left out from the beginning. And so we saw that right away. There were also requirements for the period in which an individual had been out of status that left out people who had come in on particular kinds of visas that had lapsed at particular points in time. And so, so individuals who came in with some sort of a visitor's visa, for example, that lapsed, might not be qualified because of the way that the dates cut off. So it's one of the sort of bugs and features of a program like DACA. It's easily administrable because there are sort of clear dates and parameters. But one of the consequences of that is that people who are pretty similarly situated and seem to have very comparable equities wind up getting very, very different outcomes in terms of whether they qualify or not. So even at the kind of at its inception, DACA was problematic in that way. And then we saw when the administration tried to lift that age cap and bring more people into the program, that got caught up in the litigation around DAPA and never went into effect. And then because of the kind of rescission and USCIS's decision not to take new applicants, we've seen what Laura just alluded to, which is this now kind of group of people who definitionally were eligible for DACA and should have sort of aged into the program, who have been excluded from the program because they haven't been able to apply as an initial matter. So that just increases the variegation in the terrain, which again means you can be looking at two people who look pretty comparable or have very comparable histories, but have really different legal options.
Yeah. Shannon, I'm wondering if the local context makes a difference here too, and who sort of has access to it, and who maybe in the way that local governments are providing legal resources for the continuous cycle of applying things of this sort.
Sure. Yes, and I think in terms of the question of, you know, what have we learned in this period, I think two things are important to note. One, demography is not destiny. So just because there's a large population of individuals who might have been eligible for the program or a large number of immigrants, it doesn't mean that local governments and institutions were necessarily chomping at the bit to provide resources. It all required struggle, both on the part of immigration advocates as well as educators on these campuses and in these institutions. And so, and it's also the case that those with the resources weren't always necessarily the universities that were the ones leading. And so certainly that's the case in the Ivy League and on my own campus. We are real quick to follow, not necessarily to lead. And arguably we have far more resources than other campuses. I also think that the other thing that was important to note is that this was a dynamic environment from the beginning. There was a period of time where DACA was for 3 years and certain people had a 3-year renewal. And so it's required ongoing legal advocacy, and a dynamic policy context also has meant that folks who are the experts also need ongoing training. And so we found this both amongst legal advocates. And so groups like AILA and other legal services groups have had to do ongoing training, but also us as educators, just because we see ourselves as liberals or progressives in this space, we haven't always been the best equipped to advise our students. And so I think this has been an important piece of the puzzle, is understanding both how the legal expertise gets married with the student services piece of it, and also recognizing that not everybody who was eligible for DACA were college bound. Many of those folks, for example, in my region, were potentially on farms, and educational requirements meant GED access, not necessarily university. And so really providing differential solutions, not only in the central city, but the outgoing areas. And the way that local governments came into play, I think in some places that meant providing direct funding. That was the case in the San Francisco Bay Area, where you see cities like San Francisco and Santa Clara County providing, in some cases, very innovative direct funding for legal services. And in other places that looked more like the role of philanthropy, and that, you know, in some places we have partnerships. But in terms of the challenges that I think emerged for the DACA and DACA eligible population, I think a lot of the things that we've learned both from the administrative as well as the survey data is that communities very much differed in terms of their uptake of the program. Certainly we know overwhelmingly there was an underutilization from the Asian American population, and there's varying theories about why that is, and certainly the undocumented Black population as well. Part of it has to do with what some might argue is kind of the hegemonic role of Latinos within the immigrant rights movement, and what that meant in terms of our ability to change our narrative and change the outreach strategy in different communities. in places where there wasn't already a very robust legal services community, that really required new solutions. So the federal funding that's in place for legal services across the board, with very few exceptions, does not serve people who are non-citizens or undocumented. And so that became a real problem in places where there wasn't robust legal aid in the philanthropic community. And I think that we also saw that there were an ongoing need to provide documentation. And so one of the kind of bureaucratic things about DACA is that you had to be able to show public presence. And so now at this point, that's 13 years worth of receipts and rental agreements and all these things that individuals who are in precarious living situations and work situations, maybe in the informal economy, don't have. So there's all sorts of ways in which other institutions, including local governments, became really important, and being able to broker those relationships to, for example, school administrators or health departments became really important, and another piece of the pie that advocates had to take on, in addition to providing diverse language needs and being able to reach out to, not the typical immigrant services recipient. So, and this is something that's had to be retooled not only at the turn of the election, but also at every point with renewals. Individuals' lives, their rap sheet, their application simply looks different. And the civil society advocates who have had to organize around this have had to create a diverse number of tools, some of which work for some communities more than others. And so I think while this is a national conversation, and key advocates like United We Dream and even the labor movement have provided some important guidance on this, at the end of the day, there are some solutions that work in LA that would never work where I live, right? And so this has been an important piece of the puzzle.
You all have mentioned the differences between sort of those who are eligible and take up DACA, and then sort of the larger immigrant population that either has no access to DACA, might have fallen, within the DAPA parameters, but DAPA didn't go through. Makes me wonder, and others have written about sort of the different categories of immigrants that exist in the American imaginary, right? Sort of those under DACA that have sort of a narrative around them, and those sort of left out of DACA. Can any of you speak to sort of that relationship? What is the issue of what's the relationship between DACA and the broader sort of immigrant rights movement? Are there tensions? Are these tensions overblown? Are there more alliances than anything else?
I can jump in here, but if Laura, I know you also are doing some of this work. I don't know if you want to say something from the student advocate perspective.
I mean, I can say a little bit about that there's just like a history of tensions, and they shift back and forth, right? So I think that undocumented youth really led the charge for DACA, right? And, prior to that, for the DREAM Act, the federal DREAM Act, right, to create a pathway to legalization. And there was tensions there with the larger immigrant rights movement because, some accusations of selfishness, right? That you're looking out for yourself, and what about your parents? What about your family members? But then that kind of switching after DACA, and then DACA becoming sort of a centerpiece of this mainstream immigration movement. And then now, I think flipping that script again, where DACA recipients and immigrant youth are really pushing back on this narrative of deservingness that they've been framed with, right? That somehow they are more deserving than their parents, and then sort of saying we need to be having this broader move, right? So I think there's been a lot of back and forth as we've had to negotiate the complications, right, of trying to fight for something while also not othering other groups and people within your own family, right, within your own community. I think that's a very complicated line to walk, especially because DACA and all immigration statuses are shared, right, within families. It's not just an individual status, but it's something that you're negotiating with your family members, with your community members, and things that happen to them then affect you, right, both positive and negative. And that's led to a lot of hard conversations.
Jennifer, have you seen differences in the legal strategies in these two, sort of the DACA and then sort of the rest of the movements, or sort of the legal arguments?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting, so two things, I guess one thing to note is that the way in which the advocacy from, students who received AB 540 protections and benefits in California, the advocacy from those sort of early beneficiaries of legal protection really, I think, pushed and changed a narrative of reform that was sort of the inside the beltway, kind of old school immigrants' rights organization story of, of the deserving or good immigrants versus bad, and really started to push on that as a thing, right? That's not actually a thing, and it's much more complicated than that. And in so doing, they also disrupted, I think, some of the ways in which immigrants' rights advocacy has been anti-Black and has sort of positioned itself in opposition to Blackness. And so there's been, I think, really hopeful moves that gesture in the direction of more cross-racial alliances, alliances that are sort of attentive to differences of class, and those, I think, moves have been good. I think what makes all of this challenging is the extent to which the benefits that have been won over the last few years have really been very tenuous and very temporary. So DACA is defined to be temporary and tenuous, and it fits into a legal framework that was really set up with temporary protected status. It's even more temporary than that, in that there's not even a hook in a statute for DACA, but TPS sort of looks the same. It's temporary. It has to be constantly renewed. There's this sort of need for someone somewhere in the administration to make a decision that you get to stay. And that really complicates organizing. And I think, as Laura's depressing data shows us, it complicates people's lives. And so this is the way in which I think my colleague here at UCLA, Cecilia Menkenbad, has talked about temporariness as a sort of a governance strategy for immigration, and that's what we see, right? That's how all of these legal benefits have been set out over the last few years, and it makes it tough to live, let alone to organize and plan. And so I think, if nothing else, what this data reveals to us, and what the kind of struggles of the last few years and the legal struggles in the courts have shown us, is the need for something much more robust, much more permanent than the kinds of solutions that we've seen.
Yeah. I was wondering, the discussion makes me think about, and I know, Shannon, you were speaking a lot to this, the importance of the local context. Are there any surprises in the way we think about the local context? So we might think that it's New York, San Jose, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, places, Chicago, that might have more of these protections for DACA or sort of dreamer students. But are there surprises? Are there like rural areas? Are there places in the South that have provided some of these protections? Or is it everything basically, along these partisan lines, the way we tend to think of this?
Well, we didn't do work in the South, and there's others who've been doing this ongoing work. Jennifer Jones, Hannah Brown, Helen Merrow have done work in the South whose work I would commend to you. But I think there's a couple of things that perhaps wouldn't have been surprising if we started from the question of immigration as part of the broader field of carceral studies. And one of the things that I mentioned before was this question of to what extent DACA provided a shield for encounters with policing, or to what extent individuals are having differential experiences with law enforcement. And that, when we talked with people, we made a very significant effort to talk with folks both in central cities and in suburbs, in whiter and in more immigrant dense areas of each of the regions. And one of the things that was very interesting is that across the board, people had almost universally had some kind of negative encounter with law enforcement. And even though in a place like Houston, which is probably the most hyper-diverse place in the country, the diversity did not shield them from having, even with Latino law enforcement, negative experiences. And so the kind of universal experiences that people were having, regardless of what's immigrant friendly or not, I think really stuck out to us in terms of the importance of DACA. And this includes in places where we typically think of being sanctuary cities. San Francisco has oscillated back and forth about that. And in places where we have a strong, active immigrant rights movement. The other thing that I think was also perhaps surprising is that a lot of the, when I say we didn't do work in the South, that's because I'm from Texas and there's an ongoing debate about whether Texas is the South. But Texas and Houston, there's a lot of reasons why we might consider it to be a more conservative place. But I think Houston in particular is a look into what the future of the kind of democratic movement is going to look like. So these purple areas where there really is a mix between very strong conservative aspects, but also strong and emerging, although of a different flavor than, say, the Bay Area Democratic components. There's actually a robust, even if more thinly spread, immigrant rights movement. And so some of the assumptions that you might have about innovation and about immigrant activism are kind of torn apart. And if you look critically at places where they have to contend on a daily basis with national leaders who are actively working against DACA, like Ted Cruz, like Cornyn, the kind of, from a social movement perspective, the amount of innovation and collaboration and coalition building that's happening there that perhaps you wouldn't see in a place like the Bay Area or even in New York City, where it's perfectly reasonable to go to your own side of the ring because you've got a stronghold in local politics. Here you have a lot more what we might think of as strange bedfellows being struck. I'll say one last thing, and that is that in terms of the inter-immigrant solidarity, some of the work that I've been doing with Sofia Aptekar really highlights that on college campuses, especially in recent months, this idea of immigrant students and immigrant scholars, international scholars, has the boundaries that typically have been there have been blurred. And so we have overwhelmingly thought about DACA as being the kind of main rubric for undocumented students, but increasingly attacks on international students, even on H-1B scholars, and just the undocumented population in general, knowing that each of these populations could fall in and out of that status overnight, have created some solidarities, even though, for example, on my campus, where there have been elements who have tried to sow discord between them and say, well, these are the people who did it the right way and did it, these are the folks who didn't. I think the students themselves are refusing, just as they did with their families, refusing to kind of adopt the deservingness narrative, are also refusing to do that to their peers. And so I think that's hopeful.
Nice. You've mentioned the elections and the role of politics. We now have questions bubbling up from our audience. Someone asked, what's your prediction for immigration reform if Biden wins the presidency? Anyone want to take that?
I think it is, we would need to know what happens in Congress as well. And this may be one important lesson from Obama sort of post 2010. If you don't have Congress, it's really tough to get anything done. So I think when we're thinking about electoral politics and we're thinking about immigration, Shannon's remarks make it clear that it matters all the way up and all the way down. So it matters who's president, but it also matters who's in Congress and whether you can get a bill passed. And it matters then for implementation and protection and policing, who your district attorney is and who your governor is and who the state legislatures are and who your city council members are. So I think, one important lesson that we have learned over the last 4 years is that a lot can be done at the local level, and so it matters who's empowered at the local level. So we should be attentive to electoral politics at all levels. So I would say I'm, somewhat optimistic about the possibility of immigration reform if the Democrats are controlling both White House and Congress. Less optimistic if that's not the equation. In fact, I think if that's not the equation, it'll be very difficult to get anything done. So that requires a lot. And then there's the question, which I will leave for others to evaluate, which is what does that immigration reform package look like? It raises a lot of the vexing questions that we have been alluding to throughout this conversation. Who's brought into that? Who's included in that? Who's left out of that? What compromises are people striking? And I think those questions are very much live right now and are part of the ongoing conversations within the Democratic Party about what a reform agenda would look like for them. And I think those are conversations that that kind of require activist intervention and attention.
Okay. Another question from our audience. So maybe some background. Right now, there's a current movement in California grassroots organizations to overturn Prop 209 as it affects college admissions. And someone asked, how might overturning California Prop 209 assist college applicants who don't have work permits or social security numbers or are not eligible for DACA? Is there a connection there?Maybe Laura?
Like, I don't know that. I'm looking at Jennifer. Not a lawyer. I think that we're not looking at immigration status in terms of admission, right? Yeah. So I don't see how there would be a connection there.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think one possibility to think about is whether sort of more robust race-based admissions programs generate more diverse student bodies on campus, and therefore possibly lend support to movements on campus that are immigrant facing. But I think it's hard to know. I don't think it would hurt if Prop 209 were resigned to the dustbin of history. I don't think that would hurt anything. I don't know exactly how the synergies would play out, though.
Yeah, great. And let's see here. Is there a relationship between the Black Lives Matter movement and the DACA or the Dreamer movement now? Anyone?
There's been, I can say a little bit, that I think there's been attention to diversifying the immigrant youth movement for a long time, and that includes working with folks that identify as undocu-Black, right? And trying to do that work. And I think that started, when I was involved with immigrant rights work during graduate school, so 2009, 2010, there was a lot of coalition building, to try and reframe this as not a Latino issue, right? To build coalitions with Asian Pacific Islanders, but also with Black communities, and trying to build up those connections, and try and expand how we think about immigration, undocumented immigrant communities, but also the need for immigration reform, and build up those coalitions so that we could then fight for better policies that would serve all of these groups. So I think that's there's been a lot of work there, and I think that's continued to grow. And we see that now there's a lot more of conversation. I see that at UCI, there's a lot of conversation amongst undergraduate students, even prior to our current moment, where really attention to Black Lives Matter has exploded. But when it was, the past couple of years, there's been a lot more attention to addressing anti-Blackness within the immigrant community, and having conversations about that, and trying to bring in folks who identify as undocu-Black, and making sure that they feel included in these spaces and served by undocumented student support services.
And certainly, I think this is a place for regional differences of who immigrant students are and what they look like matter. So being on the East Coast now, and certainly in New York City, when we talk to folks about who was their dream team and who was the kind of population of DACA students and who were the other affinity groups that they're working with, that looks very different than many of our California campuses. And as I mentioned earlier, I think increasingly, although certainly not, this isn't a new thing, I think if you see some of the student-led movements like United We Dream and others who are really focusing on the carceral state and really coming at this from an abolitionist perspective, it's impossible to not engage in the racial justice conversations coming out of Black Lives Matter, and certainly having a real critical moment in terms of questioning the idea of, as Obama put it, felons not families, and thinking through, even in the post-detention work that we're doing here locally, how do you do that in conjunction with some of the post-release work that is happening in a very concrete way that happened where I live, is thinking through, for example, the call to release people from detention, immigration facilities had to happen in conjunction with the call to release folks from our overpopulated prisons in California and upstate New York and elsewhere. And those are not easy conversations to have. And certainly there isn't consensus in the immigrant rights community about that. But certainly, if we look at it from a perspective that even documented individuals, and certainly individuals and their family, are subject to the deportation pipeline. It has to start there.
Great.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just I agree with all of that. I think it's also really taking it back to Shannon's earlier comments on policing and how immigrant communities experience policing is varied at the local level. But I think, how people get brought into the pipeline for deportation is, most commonly through interactions with local police. So to the extent the Black Lives Matter movement has shown the spotlight on kind of the urgency of examining what policing practices are and how they are not egalitarian, how there are great inequalities in how violence is exercised and how force is brought to bear. I think those conversations are directly relevant also to the immigration enforcement conversation. And so we're seeing, I think, a lot more reflection on the ways in which those two questions are really linked. And I think it kind of bringing it all home was the fact that it was Customs and Border Protection that was brought into the streets of Portland to suppress dissent, which sort of suggests that what happens at the border is not just a border story, but it's a policing story. And the more we can sort of understand the connections in those policing stories, I think the more these synergies, the obvious importance of these synergies become important, become clear.
Great, those are great links. I want to get just a couple last questions here. What about public support for DACA? Did the highly visible, highly publicized caravans have any effect on sort of the public's perception of DACA? Anyone?
The immigrant caravans?
Yeah.
The southern border?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it certainly shifted the conversation. Certainly there was a public misperception that any of those folks who are coming across the southern border were eligible for DACA, because certainly they weren't, given the time frame. But I think it did change I think it impacted the conversation in two ways. One, I think it fed into this narrative at the time, if people remember, around the surge, kind of this ahistorical narrative that we were being overrun. And I think it definitely kind of contributed to that white suburban mom terror that was kind of being fueled. And I think the other thing that it did, though, is to force the immigrant rights conversation in terms of people who are here already to be in conversation with a transnational conversation about the right to stay home and the transnational impacts of militarism and in terms of economic policy. And I think the immigrant rights movement has, in some places, had those conversations. Certainly we have Los Otros Dreamers and other groups that have been doing kind of this cross-border connections, but overwhelmingly our immigration policy is domestic focused and ahistorical and not really focused on what are the push factors. And so I think for the immigrant rights movement, it also had an impact. We couldn't ignore that reality.
Great. Let me take this last question. It's for Laura. What is the UC system doing to prepare and serve future students who will not have a Social Security number or work permit because they're not eligible for DACA?
So I think the system has increasingly thought about how to serve the student population, and under former UC President Janet Napolitano, there was a lot of investment in financial investment, right, in funding undocumented student programs, the hiring of professional staff members to work with the student population, and creating UC Immigrant Legal Services. So there's been a very intentional expansion, and we'll see what that looks like under our new president. But there's been this creation of programs, and within those programs, right, the practices have really intentionally tried to serve the student population, right? Because when you have students walking in your door that say, I can't apply to this, I can't do this, right? The program coordinators and directors are trying to serve that student population, or should be, right? So I think that you see that happening on the ground, right, at the director level, with a lot of innovation around programming for this particular group. So at UC Irvine, we started an internship program, a fellowship program. It's not an internship, but a fellowship program for folks to do project-based work and receive a fellowship stipend. And get some professional development, right? So really creating opportunities that are very innovative that will serve the student population. not the same, but as what other students might access, but still prioritizing this group. And I think as the system or campuses really shift in that direction, I can see that happening more. But that's really happening on the ground, right? What directors are able to implement on their campuses and imagine and get support for. There hasn't necessarily been system-wide work to create those kinds of programs that more uplifts what programs are going on and encourages them to be established. But every campus kind of has its own, right, unique way of doing things. The system, though, has created, worked with Immigrants Rising, right, a Bay Area organization to provide information and like a packet of information to students on like how to start your own LLC and other kinds of thinking about independent contracting and imagining other kinds of employment opportunities that wouldn't require work authorization. So I think the more that we build up those two different areas, I think we'll be better able to serve that student group.
Great. In the last minute we have left, I just want to go around quickly. Any final takeaway that you want our audience to remember? And we'll go quickly, 20 seconds or so. Let's start with Jennifer.
Wow, 20 seconds, I would say.
30 seconds.
No, I guess I would say vote, it matters. That may be the only thing I can think of to say in the time that I have, so I'll pass it on.
Great, Shannon?
And I'll say something I actually heard Jennifer say before, which is to look beyond electoral and legal victories and to think through not only the letter of the law, but also what comes beyond. I think anyone who's been in the immigrant rights movement can attest that none of it happens without struggle, and to kind of keep your eye on bipartisan accountability. I think the current tactics that we're seeing are a nice synergy between the last two administrations, and certainly we need to continue to be vigilant.
Great, Laura?
I'm going to go micro level and say let's not just focus on the benefits of DACA, but also think about the limitations and what we can do on the ground to support students with DACA, but also those that don't have DACA, right? And really trying to actively, despite this conversation, actively decenter DACA, right? And how we think about this group of young adults.
Great. I want to thank everyone for joining me here today. I want to thank the audience for your active participation. I want to remind you that our next IGS Fall 2020 event will be on October 1st, where we'll be talking about the census, race, and Latinos in the United States. Thank you so much.